There was one year in Olympic history when the winner crashed face first onto the track, quit the race halfway through, and was still crowned champion. Not because he was the best, but because he was the emperor. In 67 AD, Nero bent time itself, bribed the gods, and turned Greece's most sacred games into a stage for his own madness. This is not a story about sport. This is the moment when history was forced to applaud a tyrant. In the year 67 AD, the ancient world witnessed a spectacle that defied both tradition and sanity. It was an event that turned the most sacred ground of Greece into a dark comedy, drenched in the stench of gold and fear. The Olympic Games, the holy sanctuary where men competed for the favour of Zeus, were twisted into a personal playground for one man, Emperor Nero. You see, throughout history the Olympics were immovable. Wars paused for them, kings bowed to their schedule. But Nero did not bow. In his mind, he was not merely a politician or a ruler. He believed himself to be a divine gift to the arts, a supreme athlete, a god walking among mortals. And to prove it, he decided he must become an Olympic champion. But there was a problem. The Games were not scheduled for 67 AD. For anyone else, this would be an insurmountable obstacle. For Nero, it was a minor inconvenience. With a snap of his fingers and the threat of a legion's swords, he forced the Greek officials to do the unthinkable: delay the entire Olympic cycle by 2 years to match his vacation schedule. But the emperor did not travel alone. He didn't bring diplomats. He brought an entourage that would make modern dictators blush. He arrived with 5,000 young men known as the Augustiani. These were not soldiers of war, but soldiers of applause, a weaponized cheering section. They were trained in specific rhythms of praise, the buzzing of bees, the clashing of tiles. Their job was simple: to ensure that every time Nero breathed, the stadium erupted in hysterical adoration. And for the regular spectators, the message was clear. If you didn't clap loud enough, the soldier standing behind you would make sure you never clapped again. The atmosphere at Olympia that year wasn't one of excitement, it was one of suffocating dread. Real athletes, men who had trained their entire lives for this moment, found themselves in a lethal dilemma. Do you compete with honor and risk humiliating a psychopath who controls the world's most powerful army? Or do you swallow your pride, throw the match, and keep your head attached to your shoulders? Nero entered Greece not as a competitor, but as a conqueror of culture. He announced he would compete in everything: chariot racing, acting, playing the lyre. He intended to strip mine the glory of Greece and hoard it all for himself. The Greeks realized with horror that this wasn't a sport anymore. It was a scripted theatre of the absurd, where the winner had been decided before the torch was even lit. Before the races began, the audience had to endure a test of endurance far more grueling than any marathon: Nero's singing. Nero fancied himself the greatest vocalist of his age. He believed his voice could move stones to tears. And for the thousands of spectators crammed into the theatre under the baking Mediterranean sun, it was indeed a nightmare. The emperor established a brutal rule: while I am performing, no one leaves. No one. The gates were barred, the exits were blocked by the Praetorian Guard, weapons drawn, scanning the crowd for any sign of boredom. And Nero didn't just sing a song or two, he performed for hours. He recited epic poetry, he acted out tragedies, he plucked his lyre until his fingers bled. The historian Suetonius recorded scenes of misery so absurd they sound like fiction. The boredom and physical exhaustion in the stands reached a breaking point. We are told that women, trapped in the crush of the crowd with no way to exit, actually went into labour and gave birth right there on the stone benches. Imagine the cries of a newborn mixing with the screeching falsetto of a mad emperor. But the men resorted to even more desperate measures. Some, unable to endure another minute of Nero's poetry, feigned their own deaths. They held their breath, went limp, and allowed themselves to be loaded onto funeral biers by the undertakers. It was the only legal way out, to play a corpse. Others, fearing the guards at the gates, risked their lives by climbing over the high walls of the theatre, dropping to the ground outside, choosing broken limbs over broken eardrums. While the audience plotted their escapes, the Olympic judges, the guardians of fairness, were sweating in their togas. Nero didn't just perform, he scrutinized. He would stare directly at the judges' box, daring them to look unimpressed. He even planted spies throughout the crowd to report anyone who dared to whisper a criticism. The result of the music competition? Was there ever any doubt? Nero was declared the winner. The actual musicians, the true masters of the craft, wisely withdrew or deliberately played off-key. They knew that singing better than the emperor was a capital offence. Nero accepted the laurel wreath amidst the thunderous, choreographed applause of his soldiers, while the exhausted survivors in the audience simply wept with relief that the show was finally over. But the pinnacle of insanity was reserved for the chariot races. This was the sport of kings, a high-speed dance with death. The Olympic standard was the quadriga, a chariot pulled by 4 horses. It was the perfect balance of speed and control. But Nero? Nero was above standards. He rolled onto the track, driving a chariot pulled by 10 horses. Let that sink in. 10 wild beasts tethered to a single, fragile vehicle. It was a monstrosity. It was a tangled mess of reins and horseflesh, impossible to steer, impossible to control. The other charioteers looked on in disbelief, likely praying they wouldn't get trampled by the emperor's ego. The trumpet sounded, the race began. While professional drivers expertly navigated the track, Nero fought a losing battle against physics. His 10-horse beast was sluggish and chaotic. Then, disaster struck. At a sharp turn, the inevitable happened. Nero lost control. The massive chariot tipped, and the divine emperor of Rome was hurled into the air like a rag doll. He hit the dirt hard. The crowd gasped. Guards rushed onto the active track, dodging galloping hooves to scrape the emperor off the sand. They dusted him off and physically shoved him back into the chariot. But it was over. Battered, bruised, and humiliated, Nero couldn't even hold the reins. He forfeited the race, retiring to the sidelines in disgrace. In any sane world, if you crash and quit, you lose. But this was Nero's world. As the dust settled, the judges gathered. The crowd waited for the name of the real winner. Instead, the herald made an announcement that still echoes in the halls of shame. The winner is Emperor Nero. Their logic? They looked the crowd in the eye and declared, if His Majesty had not been unlucky enough to fall, he surely would have won because of his superior skill. Therefore, he is the champion. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. The other racers stood silent, robbed of their glory. And the cost of this verdict? Shortly after the games, Nero awarded the judges a sum of 1 million sesterces, a fortune large enough to buy a small island. The gold medal hadn't been won, it had been purchased. Nero returned to Rome not as a cheat, but as a conqueror. He brought back a haul that defied belief: 1,808 victory wreaths. He had won every event he entered, and even some he didn't. He had bullied his way into the history books. To celebrate his arrival, he refused to enter Rome through the city gates like a mortal man. He ordered a section of the ancient city wall to be demolished, creating a breach for his grand procession. He wanted to show that his power was so great, even stone walls had to yield to his magnificence. The people of Rome cheered, as they always did, but behind the smiles was a deep, simmering contempt. They saw a corpulent, delusional tyrant parading stolen plastic trophies while their empire crumbled under debt and mismanagement. But the applause eventually fades. The Olympic farce of 67 AD was the final straw for the Roman elite. The illusion of Nero's divinity shattered. Just 1 year later, in 68 AD, the Senate declared him an enemy of the state. The armies revolted. Nero, the great champion, found himself alone, hiding in a slave's villa outside Rome, listening to the approaching hoofbeats of his executioners. Realizing there was no audience left to save him, Nero prepared to take his own life. Yet, even at death's door, his delusion remained intact. His final words were not of regret for his crimes or fear of the gods. He wept for himself, whispering, "Qualis artifex pereo?" What an artist dies in me. He didn't mourn the man, he mourned the performer. With the tyrant dead, the world let out a collective breath. Back in Greece, the Olympic officials moved quickly to cleanse the stain from their sacred games. They didn't just strip Nero of his titles, they declared the entire games of 67 AD null and void. In the official records, there was no winner that year. There was no race. It was as if Nero had never stepped foot on that track. They demanded the return of the bribe money, though naturally the judges had already spent it. Nero's 1,808 crowns turned to dust, and his golden chariot became a symbol of ultimate hubris. In the end, Nero proved one thing. You can buy a judge, you can threaten a crowd, and you can break every rule, but you cannot bribe history.